there is lots of research out there that talks about the link between intimate partner violence and substance use. And so there's a lot of reasons why women might be using substances, and some of it is very much to cope with the trauma that they've experienced. And so then if they're fleeing this violence with their kids, they show up to a shelter and they had been drinking or using substances. This shelter, they do not turn a woman away. Our interest in studying this particular shelter was to learn what that experience was like for the women who were accessing the shelter. The women that we did interview were 25 in total, and of those 25 women, 16 of them indicated that they were using substances while they were at the shelter. Most of the women we talked with, they were in support of harm reduction, of that philosophy in the shelter. They did, however, also want there to be really clear guidelines, and not so much that they wanted lots of rules, but they wanted there to be clear processes of, what happens if things are not working well, and how are staff going to handle or practice this in a way that ensures everyone's safe. If somebody comes up and they're really struggling with being triggered by the behaviors that another resident is showing related to their substance use, and they bring that concern to the staff, and if the staff says, we're a harm reduction setting, you shouldn't be judging that person for their behavior, that's not going to help that person in that moment. If the staff was able to support that person through that process and talk about what's going on for you right now, what strategies are you using to cope with that, how can I support you to manage what's happening for you right now, because you can't change what somebody else is doing, that's a very different experience.
Dr. Hovey and her colleagues conducted research about the use of harm reduction in emergency shelters for women who were escaping violence. In 2016, Jeff Bardwell and his colleagues at the British Columbia Centre on Substance Use tested a similar thing, looking at seasonal emergency shelters in Vancouver. In 2017, 2 emergency shelters implemented what they called peer witness injection rooms, which were rooms designed with tables, chairs, injection equipment, and it was a place where peers could actually be there and witness someone who was injecting drugs. And then they could be there to provide education, but also be there in the case of an overdose, where they could administer naloxone, they could do rescue breathing, and contact emergency personnel. Bardwell and colleagues conducted qualitative interviews with 24 residents who used drugs at the 2 shelters. Participants reported that the peer staff didn't only support them in the injection rooms, but that support extended out into other spaces in the shelter. Overall, interview participants really preferred their experience interacting with peer workers over non-peer staff, in part because they felt they had more in common with them, such as the experience of using drugs or maybe even being unhoused. Given the success of this program, the peer worker role was more formally incorporated into shelter services, and other residents who weren't officially hired as peer workers began more informally serving in that role in the shelter. Participants framed the desire to serve as peer supporters, even if they were unpaid, as a form of collective responsibility, given the severity of the overdose crisis in Vancouver and their desire to help keep their fellow residents safe.
Even in an abstinence-based shelter, there are going to be women who are using while they're in the shelter. They're just hiding it. And so if the shelter can support that and be safe around that, it's pretty important for them to find ways to support women to be safe.